Evening and welcome to the latest of our monthly talks between the Antrim and Down branch of the Western Front Association and the Public Record Office of Northern Ireland. And today's guest is Alex Clifford, who my colleague Tom Thorpe is going to introduce in a minute. Just to let you all know, you've all been muted on entry, and that's so that we don't have any disturbances while the speaker gives his presentation. I should note that we are recording tonight's presentation, which we will make available on the PRONI YouTube site. So if anybody doesn't want their face to appear, we suggest you stop your video, and that will mean that you won't physically appear in the video. I don't think any other notices, so I'm going to, yes, sorry, the one last thing I want to say is, if you have any questions, please write them in chat, and at the end of the presentation, we will unmute you and ask you to read out your question, and Alex will try and answer it. So without any more ado, I'm going to pass over to Tom Thorpe, the Secretary of the Antrim and Down branch of the Western Front Association.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this wonderfully wet evening. I hope everybody is well. Just a few words. Alex is a teacher and historian. He's done a lot of work on the Spanish Civil War, and he's spoken to me on the Spanish Civil War on my other podcast, the Combat Morale podcast, that you can listen to in stereo. This talk is also available on the Western Front Association podcast last week, which is mentioned in dispatches. Alex is a graduate of a number of universities, including Leeds, Munich, and Northumbria, and he's an expert on interwar period. And this is his first time with us. So without much further ado, I'll hand over to you, Alex, and take it away, and I will take questions later.
Thank you, Tom, and thank you, everybody, for having me. It's a pleasure to speak to you tonight. So we are going to have a look at primarily two individuals, Paul von Hindenburg and Erich Ludendorff, who, as I'm sure many of you know a lot about the First World War, and you'll certainly have heard of those men. But I'm going to try and focus in tonight on how the First World War catapults them into being much more than just generals, into being hugely significant national, cultural, and political figures in Germany for years, for decades after the First World War. So, where you will probably have come across Hindenburg and Ludendorff before is when they are serving as the commanders of the German army in the First World War, where they form something of a double act, because Hindenburg is kind of a front man and the overall commander, and Ludendorff is the kind of chief of staff working in the background. I want to talk very briefly about the two men and their backgrounds before we get into their careers. So Paul von Hindenburg was not actually called Paul von Hindenburg until 1914. His name is there on the screen. And his given surname was his first one, von Beneckendorff, until 1914, when he rebranded himself as the much more catchy and saleable von Hindenburg. And he was, a kind of stereotypical Prussian military aristocrat from old East Prussian stock. He could trace his ancestors apparently back to the 15th century at the very least. And he had pursued a military career like many of his forefathers, quite successful, but not particularly remarkable, fighting as a junior officer in the Prussian-Austrian War, the Franco-Prussian War as well. But he'd retired 3 years before the outbreak of the First World War, because he was in his 60s, and it was time, in his own words, to make way for younger men. Erich Ludendorff was not an aristocrat from a more middle-class background, but he was also a Prussian. He was also a military man for his whole life, But he was a generation younger than Hindenburg. He was not even 50 by the 1910s. And so his career, he would have hoped, would be still on the up. He was part of the Great General Staff in Berlin, and he was known as a real kind of talent, a hard worker. But he had been cast into a kind of semi-exile by political meddling before the First World War. So he was in the relatively unfashionable position of being the commander of an infantry regiment in 1914. But 1914 really transforms these two men's lives, rescues them from what would have otherwise been historical obscurity, and they become extremely quickly Germany's foremost war heroes. Ludendorff, due to his knowledge of the ground, is attached to the German assault on the fortress town of Liège, which is, right on the, not far from the German-Belgian border. And it's a key kind of first early objective in the Germans' plan to sweep through Belgium into the heart of France. And he plays, by all accounts, an impressive part in capturing Liège. He supposedly knocks on the door of the citadel itself with his sword hilt and takes the surrender personally of the garrison. In the east, however, things don't go so well at the start of the First World War, and Germany finds itself unexpectedly on the back foot as the Russians mobilized quicker than expected. And Hindenburg is called out of retirement to take command of the 8th Army on the Eastern Front, facing the Russian incursion into East Prussia. And his chief of staff is Erich Ludendorff, who gets a very quick promotion due to his exploits in Liège. And they come together, this duo, on a train platform on their way east, and they form, in the words of Hindenburg in his memoirs, where he describes it as like a happy marriage. The qualities of the two complement each other well. I would kind of describe them in their style, that Hindenburg is, he's a delegator of a commander. He's not a details man, but he is a very good man manager. He's also got an eye for PR. And on the other hand, Ludendorff is much more of a mercurial kind of talent, at times unstable, for sure. But he really focuses in on the staff work and the practical detail of commanding an army, and later, obviously, on an even larger scale, directing a war effort. They win together, as I'm sure many of you know, a very early and decisive victory on the Eastern Front, the Battle of Tannenberg, and that turns Hindenburg and Ludendorff, and particularly the former, into war heroes overnight. And a real genuine kind of cult of personality springs up, particularly around Hindenburg. The image on the left is something that was seen in a lot of German cities in the first few years of the war, so-called Iron Hindenburgs, great big statues, often made of wood, in which people would, if you look carefully, you can kind of see queues of people in this scaffold lining up to buy iron nails that they would then hammer into Hindenburg. He really was able to establish himself really as the figurehead of the German war effort. He exceeded, I would say, the Kaiser in terms of his visibility in the public eye, in war propaganda, in newspapers and newsreels. The image on the right, if you're wondering, is an ashtray with the face of Hindenburg. And Hindenburg, he was over 6 foot tall. He has this really kind of Prussian appearance with his strong jawline and his mustache and everything. And there was also a romanticism to the idea. He's been called out of retirement to save his country in its hour of need, that it plays into as well the Germans' own perception of the First World War as it being a defensive conflict, as it being something, that's protecting the fatherland. And Hindenburg's own personal story kind of plays into that because of the fact he wins fame defending East Prussia. And the massive cult of personality that builds up around Hindenburg, and of course the First World War and the Second World War, are full of examples of generals who can spring from total obscurity to being national icons. Pétain in France, I think, was one that stands out to me as being a kind of parallel figure to Hindenburg. But they use Hindenburg and Ludendorff, they use this prestige and popularity very kind of cleverly to get their own way. And that culminates in 1916, where they force out, through the threat of their resignation, they've become too important to lose. They threaten to resign if they don't get given the overall direction of the war effort. And Hindenburg becomes chief of the general staff, and Ludendorff becomes a new title invented for him, first quartermaster general, which in effect is Hindenburg's chief of staff. And even then, that, you know, the hysteria around the two, I think, it only ratchets up. There's a Hindenburg museum opened, you know, to his life. There's the Seventh War Loan in 1917 is billed as give Hindenburg his birthday present. It's his 70th birthday that year, by giving him money to the war effort. The economic program that Ludendorff draws up in collaboration with the general staff to mobilize the German economy is dubbed the Hindenburg program. But of course, ultimately, despite their huge fame, prestige, and supposed abilities, they end up losing the First World War. And one of the things that is going to be relevant as we go on to say is that you could make a case that they are dealt a bad hand, but that they play it badly, that Hindenburg and Ludendorff, as they exercise the supreme command, make a number of decisions that in hindsight, which is of course easy to say, but in hindsight are the wrong choice. They push very, very hard in the spring of 1917 for unrestricted submarine warfare. They are convinced that it will push Britain out of the war, which of course it doesn't. In fact, it drags in the United States. They push against the wishes of the foreign ministry for an extremely punitive peace treaty on the Eastern Front, when the new Bolshevik government in Russia asks for peace terms. And that peace treaty, which leaves the Central Powers in control of a vast swathes of Eastern Europe, ties down 500,000 German troops, including all of the German army's cavalry, in Eastern Europe, trying to manage the Baltic states, Belarus, Ukraine, which are in state of semi-revolutionary fervor. You know, you even have German troops being sent off to Finland at a time in 1918 where they really could have done with those troops in the Western Front. Talking of the Western Front, the decision taken in the winter of 1917-18 by Hindenburg and Ludendorff, and they take no kind of opposition to this. They overrule, as they constantly do from 1916 onwards, overrule any objections, is to go for an all-out offensive in the West in 1918 to win the war before the Americans arrive. And ultimately, of course, those efforts fail as well. And we could go into huge amounts about the spring offensives of 1918, but one case that has been made is that they are reckless and that they bleed the German army dry and therefore precipitate and bring about much more quickly the ultimate collapse that is to come in the second half of the year. So in September 1918, as the Allies launched, Ferdinand Foch launches his grand offensive on the Siegfried Line, or as the Allies call it, the Hindenburg Line of defenses, Ludendorff realizes that the war is lost. He's in a state of, at the very least, nervous breakdown. And he tells Hindenburg, who breaks down in tears, that it is time to seek an armistice. They then decide that it would be best both to shift responsibility and to get better peace terms from the Allies, that a democratic government should ask for peace, not the current regime in Germany. And this sets off a chain of events in October and November 1918, whereby we come about the fall of the Kaiser, the German Revolution, and the armistice on the 11th of November 1918. Now, when we want to trace the aftermath of the careers of Hindenburg and Ludendorff, if you like, or perhaps the second stage of their careers in which the First World War really has a long hangover into what comes next. I think the most important thing, and the thing I'm going to start with, is the stab in the back myth, because that is central to how Germans perceive the First World War, and how Hindenburg and Ludendorff are able to come from what should be a really disadvantageous position of they are the men who've lost us the greatest war that mankind has ever seen, to becoming, or remaining, I should say, war heroes and men who will have a lot of influence in the new democratic regime. And the way they do that is through their curation and promotion of the stab in the back myth. The stab in the back myth, very briefly, I'm sure many of you might well have heard of it before, but it is the belief, that even conspiracy theory, you might say, that the German army did not in fact lose the First World War, that, as the cartoon vividly demonstrates, the German army was stabbed in the back by a combination, or kind of insert your villain of choice, but weak politicians, democratic politicians, pacifists, revolutionaries. You can see in the background kind of crowds with red flags, but also, of course, famously, Jews, who are portrayed as, well, you can see here, war profiteers. They're also sometimes portrayed as behind the actions of communist revolutionaries, hence the kind of idea of Judeo-Bolshevism, the idea that Bolshevism is somehow a Jewish plot. But also they are tied in with the new democratic system that is deemed to have undermined Germany's war effort. Now, as for Hindenburg and Ludendorff and the role they play in this, I've kind of given them their own titles here. So Ludendorff I'm billing as the chief architect of the stab in the back myth. He, in September 1918, when he takes the decision that it's time to seek an armistice, he tells his staff that it's time to shift responsibility and make sure that the people who, in his eyes, are responsible take the blame. And in his eyes, what he means at this point is the democratic politicians of the Reichstag, who've never had any power before in the German parliament. They have been a kind of almost advisory body rather than an executive one. But Ludendorff believes that it's time to shift that responsibility. And so from the very beginning, he's looking to obviously save his own skin. And in October 1918, he has a kind of moment of weakness where he sees President Wilson's peace terms, or armistice terms, I should say, and he balks from it, and he actually issues in Hindenburg's name an order to the German army in late October 1918 to ignore the peace negotiations and fight on. This gets Ludendorff the sack. He threatens, as he often did, to resign, and the Kaiser accepts his resignation in what Ludendorff himself called the bitterest moment of his life. And he isn't in a good way, Ludendorff, at this point, and you know, it's understandable. The pressure on him was enormous. The weight of the defeat, gigantic to bear, millions of deaths on your conscience, including that of his own stepsons. And he, according at least to his wife, after he's sacked, he kind of sits at his desk for days on end, just staring straight ahead, mumbling quietly to himself. And he decides to flee the country. He's afraid that the revolutionary mobs are going to kind of lynch him, perhaps. So he flees to Sweden, supposedly in disguise with a false beard and sunglasses, but we don't need to necessarily put stall on that. But he does flee to Sweden. And as soon as he gets there, he sets about writing his memoirs. And I think this is very important, because many, in all the countries that participate, you see a lot of generals kind of try and get out their memoirs. Lloyd George famously does in Britain, that tells their very specific version of events of the First World War. And Ludendorff, he, by February 1919, has finished his memoirs, which is, remarkable. Then he always was a kind of almost, he overworked himself, I would say, at all times of his life. And these are not a light read either. They're 270,000 words across 2 volumes. And of course, being the man he is, they are very kind of detail heavy. They are not exactly light reading. They're not for the general reader at all. But they have a clear message, and that is that the military was betrayed. And his prime targets at this stage are the politicians of the Kaiserreich, men like, say, Bethmann Hollweg, the German chancellor, who have just not backed the military up. They haven't provided it with the political support. They haven't been harsh enough on internal dissent in Germany. They haven't, ruled with an iron fist to give the generals the backing they need. That's what Ludendorff says, of course. He also makes allusions, kind of almost dog whistle language, I would say, to other groups. He says that peoples who through their whole history have been destructive rather than constructive also undermine the German war effort, which is an oblique reference, I'm sure, to Jews. And once he's written these memoirs, he returns to Germany and, of course, gets those published and begins to spread this conspiracy theory that the army was never beaten. If only people had listened to the generals, if only people had listened to the army, we would have won the war. Hindenburg, on the other hand, has quite a different immediate post-war period. I don't know that it's that well known, but Hindenburg doesn't leave command when the First World War ends. He remains as Chief of the General Staff. And he is welcomed home as a victorious commander. The new government of Germany, the democratic government headed by the Social Democratic Party of the center-left, buys into this idea that the army, and it very quickly the phrase catches on, and you see this phrase on German First World War memorials, undefeated in the field, that at the end of the war, we were on enemy territory. Our army was never beaten. And even these democratic politicians buy into this Hindenburg was undefeated myth. They say, they are welcoming home the victorious general. This is the actual statements being put out in November and December 1918, which is almost kind of beyond belief when you think about it today. But the reason that so many people buy into the Hindenburg myth still at this point is because he is such a beloved national figure. I think there isn't a modern comparison, I would say. Maybe you could argue in the United Kingdom that in the political sphere, you can't criticize the sitting monarch, but that would be the closest, because no one would dare criticize Hindenburg. The level of hero worship and love in society, there's no question he was the most popular single individual in the country, the most well-known, probably single individual in the country, and someone who is kind of this all things to all men. He's dutiful, he's honorable, he's reliable. He kind of embodies German kind of honor and dignity. And so he remains in post, and the new democratic regime embraces Hindenburg in a way they just don't with Ludendorff. In the summer of 1919, of course, there is the Versailles Peace Treaty, which is punitive terms we don't need to go into today, but it causes an absolute storm in Germany, as I'm sure you know. And the government, as I say, the new democratic government resigns rather than signs. Obviously, then some new ministers have to come in. It doesn't really achieve anything, but the point they're making is they really are opposed to the terms of Versailles. So the new president of Germany, Friedrich Ebert, who has worked closely with the military, in part for self-preservation, to put down communists, he telephones the Supreme Command on the day of the ultimatum that the Allies have said, sign or we invade. And he says his words to the High Command are that we are willing to fight. We'll go back to war rather than sign Versailles. So long as Hindenburg says there is a chance, there is even the slightest chance that we will get something better than Versailles by restarting hostilities, then we'll back the military and we'll go for it. Of course, that wasn't a realistic option, and the Supreme Command was well aware that that wasn't a realistic option. And Hindenburg tells his chief of staff, we can't do it. You ring the president and tell him, sign. The next day, though, Hindenburg resigns from the military in protest against the Treaty of Versailles. His advice to the government is, of course, kept secret to preserve his legendary status. So he completely sidesteps responsibility for the defeat and responsibility for Versailles. And he becomes the cheerleader in chief for this new narrative that is coming about in 1919, that the defeat was a conspiracy, that it was a stab in the back. And I've got another political cartoon there of Hindenburg pulling back the curtain and showing Germany being literally stabbed in the back. And the reason I've called him the cheerleader in chief is simple. In the autumn of 1919, the German parliament, the Reichstag, called an inquiry to investigate, a public inquiry to investigate what went wrong in the First World War. And Hindenburg and Ludendorff are called as witnesses to answer under oath a series of questions about the First World War. They meet beforehand, the night before, and Ludendorff goes through, using parts of his memoirs, interestingly, some of the exact same text, prepares a statement for Hindenburg to read. So they arrive with great fanfare in central Berlin, huge crowds, kind of lots of patriotic fervor, and a lot of public anger that Hindenburg is being called like a kind of naughty schoolboy to answer for his actions. The parliamentarians have sent six questions for him to prepare to answer. And they ask the first one. The first one is about unrestricted submarine warfare. When was the decision taken? Why was the decision taken? And Hindenburg simply stares contemptuously at the panel, does not answer the question, doesn't even say a word. He simply gets out of his pocket his prepared statement and reads. Hindenburg wasn't a great public speaker, but these words are powerful because he uses the literal phrase stab in the back, and he uses a piece of fake news, a story that had gone around Germany at the time, that an English general had famously declared that the German army was stabbed in the back. It's not true. We don't need to get into all the details of how false information can spread, but this is so significant because the most beloved man in the country is saying under oath that the country was betrayed, that politicians and revolutionaries undermined the war effort, that their army had not been defeated. Under oath, with thousands of people kind of crowding outside, with journalists, meaning it's printed in the press across the country, debated and discussed for days and weeks afterwards. This is when what is a conspiracy theory goes mainstream. This is where what had been a fringe view becomes the dominant narrative. And of course, Hindenburg and Ludendorff's motives for lying are very human ones, avoiding responsibility, avoiding blame, but also preserving your own status and reputation. At exactly the same time as Hindenburg was giving this testimony, he was preparing a run for the presidency. That presidential election, incidentally, never happened due to political instability, but the point stands that he was very much aware of what he was doing. And I think a final point on this, these are the country's two most well-known generals. These are the experts. The experts are saying the army wasn't defeated. The experts are saying you were betrayed. They're lying, but it has an extremely powerful effect. And Hindenburg himself brings out his memoirs the following year. Unlike Ludendorff, they are deliberately ghost-written to be readable, to be populist, to be, enjoyed by a wide audience. And again, of course, there's a repetition of the stab in the back myth. So that's what really sets the stage, I think, for Hindenburg and Ludendorff to go on to play a really important role in Germany after the First World War. And it sets the stage of how Germans, at least in the interwar period, perceive the First World War, how they think about the First World War, how they remember the First World War. They remember it as a betrayal. They remember it as the case of internal enemies, traitors, undermining their country, which has obviously disastrous consequences for the new democracy, which is instantly seen as illegitimate, as the product of November criminals, of traitors, but also has long-range consequences in terms of a worldview built on conspiracy theory, built on the idea that we lost the last World War because of internal betrayal by Jews, communists, others, feeding into decisions taken, obviously, in the 1940s. Now, with that kudos and reputation that Hindenburg and Ludendorff have, they go on to try and be important figures in Germany in the years after the First World War, with varying degrees of success and in their own quite different ways. So Ludendorff really plays his arm at being a revolutionary, a putschist. He gets involved in various kind of far-right plots. He is the brains behind the ill-fated Kapp Putsch in 1920, the first attempt by the right to overthrow the Democratic Republic, where Freikorps, that's ex-First World War soldiers who haven't demobilized, they storm central Berlin, they seize the Chancellery, they seize the government quarter, and Ludendorff leads a small cabal of generals and right-wing politicians as they march through the Brandenburg Gate. He later claims that he was merely out on a morning walk in the spring and saw a group of soldiers and felt inclined to go over and have a word with them and just accidentally marched through with them to seize the government. It's not true, but as always, Ludendorff finds ways of making excuses that he was not to blame. The Kapp Putsch fails miserably. There's a general strike called and they can't even get typists to write up their declarations. They can't get money out the central bank. And they kind of have to skulk out of the capital, having failed in their objectives. And Ludendorff flees Berlin to Bavaria. He settles in Munich in southern Germany. And he does that because Germany was and is a much more regionalized, decentralized country than the UK. Bavaria, like all the states of Germany, was before 1918, it was a kingdom with its own army. In the First World War, the Bavarian army was obviously within the German army, but its own entity with its own organization. And in Bavaria in the early 20s, they are billing themselves as a kind of cell of order amongst the chaos of the Weimar Republic. This is a kind of far-right bubble almost, where they welcome in terrorists, putschists, all sorts of things. There's a terrorist group, far-right terrorist group that operates with the help of the Munich police across Germany, murdering high-ranking politicians. And Ludendorff is one of these people who kind of almost seeks sanctuary in Bavaria. And of course, if you're in Bavaria in the early 1920s, in Munich, and you're in far-right circles, he comes into contact with Adolf Hitler and the early Nazi party. Ludendorff's there, he's in the center of the photograph, hobnobbing there with the leading kind of figures of Bavaria, including the Premier, Gustav von Kahr, who has the cross above his head, and the Chief of Police. And for Ludendorff, this is, he's the kind of superstar of the German far right at this time, built on his wartime reputation because of what he did in the First World War. He is a hero, and because so much of far right politics at the start of the Weimar era is paramilitary in nature, it's paramilitary formations full of First World War veterans, they defer to rank. So Ludendorff is the most senior figure because he's the ranking general. And he comes into contact, and I've said, with Adolf Hitler, and they establish kind of a symbiotic relationship. For Hitler, meeting Ludendorff, being let into his circle is like he's made it. Even in the early 20s, he's a bit of a nobody. Ludendorff is a somebody, and Ludendorff is able to secure him an awful lot of money through his channels for the early Nazi party. Not to mention the prestige that comes with attaching yourself to Ludendorff. On the other hand, Ludendorff equally sees Hitler as, somebody he can work with. Ludendorff isn't a great public speaker. Ludendorff knows that he's got to win over the masses, and Hitler seems like the perfect person to do it. Hitler at this time kind of dubbed himself the drummer, the guy who was going to drum up the masses to support some sort of vague nationalist project. And this comes to a head in 1923 with the Beer Hall Putsch. I think it's worth emphasizing that the Beer Hall Putsch, the Munich Putsch in November 1923, is completely rooted in German and indeed Ludendorff and Hitler's perception of the First World War. And the reason is this: they staged the putsch on the 8th of November 1923. It is the anniversary of the abdication of the King of Bavaria. When the German Revolution spread to Bavaria, there was a huge uprising in Munich, and the domino fell, so to speak. It is a day of shame where Bavaria fell to the revolutionaries who stabbed Germany in the back. But it's also about the First World War, because the Beer Hall Putsch would never have happened without an event earlier in the year that threw Germany into chaos, and that was the French occupation of the Ruhr. The French and Belgian armies marched into Western Germany in January 1923 to basically extract reparations payments, because Germany had fallen behind already on their payments due under the Treaty of Versailles. And this threw the country into a state of crisis. It led to the hyperinflation crisis, which you've probably heard of, which I don't think we need to go into too much now. But more importantly, it was like a red rag to a bull for the nationalist right, because the call throughout 1923 was, let's go to war again, basically. It was a levée en masse. Let's mobilize the nation for war, a people's war of the whole nation arming itself to march on the French and to drive them out of our homeland. That is what Ludendorff, Hitler, and many others on the German right were agitating for throughout 1923. And Hitler and Ludendorff together build a movement called the Kampfbund, a combat league, basically, a paramilitary organization, which Hitler is the political leader, Ludendorff is the military commander, and they're going to they want to practice what they preach. They want to seize power. They want to defeat the French. And they make their bid in November 1923, and I think Ludendorff is sometimes portrayed as like a peripheral figure in the Beer Hall Putsch, and naturally the focus, with hindsight, is on Hitler and the rise of Hitler and how Hitler, his path to power. But that's the complete wrong way around. The putsch at the time, as it was reported, was called the Ludendorff-Hitler putsch. Ludendorff first, because Ludendorff was well known, Hitler wasn't. There's no way the early Nazi movement would have thought in 1923, when they're still essentially a Bavarian movement, that they could seize national power. Not without Erich Ludendorff at the head of their column, and not without Erich Ludendorff as their candidate for national leadership. If the Beer Hall Putsch had succeeded, which is a gigantic if, it never would have done, but Ludendorff would have been dictator of Germany. Hitler would merely have been his kind of political right-hand man. And even actually, during the putsch itself, Ludendorff is the one who makes all the key decisions. He's the one who finally persuades the Bavarian leaders in the beer hall to support the putsch. And he then comically releases them on their word of honor. They then immediately go and start mobilizing the police and the army to crush the putsch. He's the one who insists they all decamp to the Bavarian War Ministry for the night and wait for the Bavarian leadership to show up, which they never do. He's the one who then decides the floundering putsch needs to be revitalized with a march through the city center, an armed march, to whip up the crowds and show that the people on their side. And as they're marching, he's the one who decides to go down the road, which is on the left of this picture, the narrow road. He's marching at the head of the column. He leads them down this narrow road beside the Feldherrnhalle, a Marshall Memorial in the center of Munich, where there is roughly where those pedestrians are standing on the left-hand side of the screen. There is a police cordon waiting, and they shoot the advancing Nazis, and the Beer Hall Putsch ends in disaster. And with it, Ludendorff's career, to some extent, ends. Although Hitler's famously imprisoned for about a year after this. Ludendorff, while he's gone, is pretty much the leader of the Nazi Party, which, again, is often overlooked. He tries to build a wide coalition of far-right nationalists across the country. He fails. He's no politician, and his views are becoming more extreme in the mid-20s. He begins to become too radical even for the Nazis. He begins to see Christianity alongside Judaism and Bolshevism as part of the problem. After all, Jesus was a Jew, and therefore Christianity must be a Jewish plot to destroy Germany. And so, even the center of this image, I think, shows you the centrality of Ludendorff. He's right there in the middle. I also think this image is slightly comic. It's the trial itself here, because Hitler is the only really leading figure without a uniform. Next to all these officers, Lance Corporal Hitler would not have quite cut an impressive figure. Anyhow, Ludendorff fades away really from the mid-20s onwards. And that brings us, I guess, to our last part, really, which is about Hindenburg. Hindenburg, as I've kind of really emphasized, comes out of the First World War very well indeed, despite the defeat. And he is a figure, as I've said there, like a father of the nation. I love this photograph. I think it's very illustrative, because this is Hindenburg during his presidency. And you can see the children at the forefront of the crowd are just kind of awestruck. And it's quite bizarre almost, because Hindenburg isn't exactly, what we would think of today as the kind of figure that a child would be speechless to meet. But he genuinely had something that I think is very hard to imagine today, to perceive in today's society, of just being an unqualified, uncriticized hero. In the 1925 presidential election, sometimes people say Ludendorff and Hindenburg ran against each other. It's not actually true. Ludendorff ran as the Nazi candidate, and as you can see, polled 1.1% of the vote, which was disastrous. And it really discredited Ludendorff from his aspirations to become leader of the Nazi Party. and he breaks with them soon afterwards. But German presidential elections at this time had a weird quirk where if no one got 50% in the first round, you then went to a second round. And the various right-wing groups that supported Karl Jarras in the first round cast around for a candidate, and despite being 77, they settle on Paul von Hindenburg. He's kind of both the ideal and he's both a terrible candidate and an ideal candidate. He's 77. He's too old for a 7-year presidential term. He also, in his conditions when he's negotiating with the Reich Bloc, as it was called, he insists, "I won't speak and I won't travel," which for an election campaign is quite the statement to make. But this photograph shows you he didn't need to speak and he didn't need to travel. All you need to do is put Hindenburg's name on the ballot paper and plaster the country with images of Hindenburg, because everyone knows his face. And you are assured that you're going to win, which is exactly what happens. It's fairly close, but he defeats the combined forces of kind of German democracy, liberalism, social democracy, and the moderate right. As president, for the first 2 years, he's kind of this reassuring figurehead. Many Germans, I've read diary entries where they talk about the fact that by voting for Hindenburg, by electing Hindenburg, they are kind of, they're redeeming their own history. I've seen diary entries refer specifically to, we are showing, by voting for Hindenburg, we show we were right in 1914, that we did nothing wrong, that Germany stood tall and defended itself in 1914 against external aggression. That was the kind of emotional symbolism behind the Hindenburg presidency. It was, of course, voting for a 77-year-old general, of course, is about the past. It's about the First World War. And it's about buying back into that wartime myth of Hindenburg as the savior of the nation, as the man who will deliver somehow greatness, somehow victory. And he is beloved. And one of the really interesting things during Hindenburg's presidency is that they keep curating that myth about the First World War. So books that are written about the First World War, both fiction and non-fiction, films that are made about the First World War, again, documentaries and dramas, they go to the president's office. The manuscripts, the scripts of the films, the edits are dealt with by the president and his civil servants, because they curate Germany's perception of the First World War and, of course, of Hindenburg himself. And, of course, there are films about Tannenberg. There are documentaries about Hindenburg's life. There are books about Hindenburg. There are books about Tannenberg. There are books about, the war effort. And Hindenburg and his staff work very hard to curate that, to edit that, to ensure that their version, the right version of the First World War, is the one that is still 10, 15 years later being given to the German people. And of course, he couldn't have done all that if he hadn't established that reputation in the First World War and preserved that reputation after the First World War through the stab in the back myth. Very, very briefly, because I realize time is pressing and we are straying further and further from the First World War. But, of course, this experiment in democracy and indeed Hindenburg's presidency end with the Third Reich and Hitler's appointment as Chancellor. In 1930, the democratic system is crumbling. There's the Great Depression. There's reparations payments biting with the Young Plan. And Hindenburg rebrands German democracy into a presidential system where the government does not require the approval of parliament, but instead rests on the powers and the prestige of the president himself. He appoints, under a guy called Heinrich Brüning, the so-called Hindenburg cabinet. And this is a cabinet, once again, it's completely built on the First World War. It is sold as, this is the front generation of 1914 to 18, taking power to save Germany in its new hour of need, the Great Depression. Brüning was, I think, a double Iron Cross winner. He was a machine gun officer. Hindenburg respected him mainly because of the fact that he regarded the machine gunners in 1918 as having fought longer and harder than the regular foot soldiers. And the Hindenburg cabinet, I think it was a 12-man cabinet formed in 1930, and I think I'm right in saying 6 of the 12 office holders were Iron Cross holders. Again, it's about the First World War. That's the lens, of course, that Hindenburg sees the world through, of course, but it's also the lens that so many Germans see the world through at this time. To have won the Iron Cross is to show that you are patriotic, is to show that you are willing to serve the nation and are capable of saving the nation in its hour of need, which, of course, the Hindenburg government wasn't. The Depression deepens. The president's term runs out in spring of 32, but he wins again, despite being by this time 84. Another 7-year term. And the appeal, this election is Hitler versus Hindenburg, basically. And the appeal is built on, again, the First World War. It's built on Hindenburg as savior of the nation, as the man who brings the country together, like in 1914, when there was no classes, there was only Germans. And it so consciously echoes that wartime propaganda. The poster on the right is such a close representation, reproduction, of wartime propaganda in terms of the image of Hindenburg. And he defeats Hitler. However, the situation by 1932 is such that the parliamentary arithmetic has broken down. Mistakes by Hindenburg and by his inner circle have led to the fact that the Nazis and communists have a negative majority in the Reichstag. They can overturn any bill. They can impeach the president even, should they wish. So he is faced with a dilemma. Either you need to get Hitler and the Nazis on side, to get Parliament back on side, bring them into the governmental coalition, or you basically need to go all out in this kind of Hindenburg regime type thing and suppress the opposition, suspend the constitution, something like martial law, and the Nazi and communist movements will have to be crushed by force. There's a lot of complex things that happened in 1932 and 1933 that really goes beyond the scope of our talk today, but I think you can basically boil it down to a decision on this as to whether you bring the Nazis inside the tent or you wield the forces of the state against the Nazis and try and crush them. Hindenburg famously chooses the former. He chooses Plan A after about 6 months of exploring the options, of deliberating, of looking at various things. And the military was not very keen on Plan B, it must be said as well. However, this leads to a coalition government in January 1933 with Hitler as Chancellor, Hindenburg as president, and a collection of Nazis alongside Hindenburg favourites, Hindenburg's inner circle, in the cabinet. Again, I don't think this is the time to go into what happens next. However, one final thing I would say is that in 1933, when Hindenburg makes this decision, it's often portrayed or even sometimes written that he was senile, that he didn't know what was going on, that he was duped. There is no evidence for that. Medically speaking, he was certainly old, frail, tired, but he wasn't. He was of sound mind. He wasn't senile, and he only really showed signs of losing touch in his final illness in 1934. In the end, in fact, Hindenburg was something of a willing collaborator to the Nazi regime. He threw his weight and prestige behind it. He was actually very quickly won over by Hitler personally, despite an early dislike in their first couple of meetings. And he only ever objected in his kind of their 18 months together to two of Hitler's actions. Once he ticked off Hitler for being critical of a previous president in a speech, which is very minor, kind of, please don't be so critical of my predecessor. And second time was, and again, it's the First World War, the Nazi law, civil service laws, which banned Jews from holding civil service posts. Hindenburg asked for an exemption for Jewish war veterans. This is sometimes often held up as evidence that Hindenburg was, a check on the Nazis, that he was really opposed to what the Nazis were doing. I would argue quite the opposite. He's saying these Jews aren't worthy of punishment because they served me in the First World War. And in a private letter, he defended the laws, saying, well, the Nazis, the Jews have been really harsh on the Nazis for many years. It's only natural that the Nazis should want to hit back. So I hope I've kind of shown how Hindenburg and Ludendorff used the First World War as a platform for, well, decades afterwards to build their own careers, to deceive the German people, and to pave the way, to some extent, for Hitler and the rise of the Nazis.